over all of Rob's cussing, because if you cuss the first 5 minutes of a YouTube video, you get delisted. So
I know. I was going to say you have to put NSFW on that.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I think it actually add more comical value by putting elephant noises every time you say something. I'll put a PHP elephant over your mouth. I talk like a sailor too. I'm no better.
Okay, let's see if I can run.
Oh no, the dreaded demo doesn't work.
Oh no, I've just verified the demo worked. We're good.
This will be the last talk we have from Justin for a year while he does daddy daycare.
Presentation mode and screen share. Okay, everyone got my screen?
Yeah, that was painless. You make it look so easy.
I don't. I am in meetings all day long. That is basically my life. So generators, we're going to talk about all about the yield is the name of the talk. I'm Justin Yost. I'm not a lead software engineer at Wirecutter. I'm an engineering manager at Wirecutter, but everything else is all the same. We do cool stuff at Wirecutter, trying to find you the best stuff to live your best life. And we're part of the New York Times, and we're actually hiring right now, as long as you don't live in Nevada, apparently. Yeah. So what is a generator? A generator is basically an iterator without the overhead of writing an actual iterator. So question raised, what is an iterator? An iterator is just a PHP object or an iterator that can be iterated itself internally. So what does that actually mean? So an object that you can iterate over internally is something like an array, a generator, or something that's an instance of this traversable class that they created in PHP 7.4, I think. It's been a while since I've been in this talk, so I don't remember exactly, but I think it was like 7.4 or 7.3. So as an example, if we have a for each loop, right, and we're iterating over each value in that is itself an iterator, right? That's an array. We're iterating over that array and we're pulling out the values and we have keys and everything else with it, right? So going back, a generator then is an iterator without the overhead of having to actually like write out that whole iteration process. So the big trick here is that generators and iterators provide for that looping mechanism without the memory overhead of the thing you are looping over. So when we go back to this array example, if we build up an array with 1,000 numbers, right? If we have 1,000 numbers in there, we have to have those 1,000 numbers in memory, and this scales up. If we have an array that has 1,000,000 numbers, we have to have 1,000,000 numbers in memory. If we have a quadrillion numbers in memory, we have to have a quadrillion numbers in the array. We have to have a quadrillion numbers in memory. So every single record that is in that array has to be in memory. This gets really problematic if you're talking about something like you're looping over a CSV or you're returning records from the database and you're having to wait for everything to get returned back, right? So what are the three different types that we're going to kind of deal with in this talk a little bit? We have an iterator, which is object-based. It has a couple different methods on it. It has a current, key, next, rewind, and valid method. So current obviously gives you the current value. Key gives you the current key that you're at. Next goes to the next value and the next key. Rewind rewinds back all the way to the front. And valid says whether or not this actual key is a valid key with a valid value. In this case, iterators, one example of these iterators are the advanced SPL iterators. That's the standard package library for PHP. So PHP has a standard package library. Included in that is a bunch of standard iterators that are available. These iterators give you that ability to have that limited memory usage that I was talking about before, where we don't have to store everything in memory, right? We can have a quadrillion numbers in our iterator, and we only need to have one record actually exposed and available in memory at a time. We have the array, which we're probably all pretty familiar with. They're simple, right? Arrays are really simple. They're probably one of the first data structures that we wind up writing in PHP as an array. They're one way, right? When you loop through an array, you can only go one way in the array. You'll notice in the iterator, right, since we have that rewind function, we can go backwards. In an array, whenever we're iterating through it, we only have one way through the array, right? We just loop forward through it. We have direct access on the array, right? In an array, you can say, hey, pull out the value at key ABC. And whatever value is at key ABC, you will get that value straight out of the array. They're memory constrained, right? Like we talked about in arrays in PHP, everything that you shove into that array has to be available in memory. Generator is kind of a hybrid between the two. A generator is much simpler to write than an iterator, right? Because those iterators are object-based, they require a lot more overhead to write, right? You have to create an object, you have to have a class, you have to have all this other junk associated with it. They have the one way, so much like an array, unlike an iterator where that iterator has that rewind functionality, the generator can only go one way, right? You can only loop through a generator in the same way that you can only loop through an array forward. You do have a couple methods on it. So even though you don't have to create this whole object and everything, it does under the hood, PHP generates an object for it. So that includes the methods current, key, and next. So again, you can get the current value, you can get the current key, and you can move to the next value, right? Notice we don't have a valid method and we don't have a rewind method, right? And limited memory usage. Unlike the array, we stick a quadrillion numbers, we stick, 100,000 different records from a database table that we're looping over. We only have the one record, the one row from the database available in the generator. So how does a generator work? There's a keyword that we use in PHP. It's called the yield keyword. The yield keyword acts as the return from a generator. So how does that work? So here's a really simple example. We have a get range function. Get range just has, we pass in a max value. In this case, I'm just setting it to a default of 15. We loop over it and we say for I is equal to 1, I less than max, I plus plus, right? So we're going to loop from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, all the way up to 15, and we'll stop, right, and end. We have this yield keyword. So we have yield I. What'll happen on that yield keyword is at that yield value, at that statement right there, I will be returned back to the function that called get range, and PHP will actually pause get range. So this for loop will pause. I will be returned back to get range. The consumer function, so the thing that called get range, will continue on its path until get range gets called again. We'll go back into the function and we'll carry back around. So in for each get range 4 as value, what will happen is we'll set up our for each loop. We'll call get range 4. So we call in get range 4. We call get range, right? We call that function. We set up our for loop. So we have for I is equal to 1. I is less than 4. We go into our loop. We yield 1. PHP pauses inside of get range. 1 gets passed back to the consumer. So it gets passed back to this for each function. That becomes our value. So now our value is equal to 1. We loop through that. We go into that loop. We call echo value, right? So we then print out value 1. We come back around in the loop. We're back to for each, and we're back to our get range function again. And get range fires off again. We come back around. We get I plus plus. So now I is going to be equal to, it was 1. Now it's 2. 2 is less than the max of 4. We come back to the yield. We yield to PHP pauses, get range. We go back into the for each. Now value is equal to 2. We echo value 2, loop back around in the for each, go back to get range. We go back into get range. PHP comes back around, 2 gets plus plus, 2 is less than 3. We yield 3, we pause, we pass 3 back into here. 3 is now the value. We echo value, we pass it back in. 3 gets incremented by 1. 3 becomes 4. 4 is no longer less than the max. Get range ends, and this for each loop ends. Any questions about that? Okay. What about if we want a key and a value? So we can have this get range again, right? Get range is doing the same thing. You'll note the only difference that we're doing here now is we're yielding it in much the same way that we set up when we set up a for each loop where we have a key and a value, right? I is going to be our key, max is going to be our value, right? So for each, we get range 4, right? That kicks off get range. I is equal to 1. 1 is less than our max of 4. We call yield 1 as the key, yield 4 as the max or the value, right? That pauses this inner function, this get range function, that kicks us into the for each function, which passes back 1 and 4. So we call key value 1, 4, right? Loop back around, we're calling get range again. That kicks us back into the function. I gets incremented by 1. 1's less than, or 2's less than 4. We go back around and we loop back around, right? And that loop just kind of keeps continuing until we hit our max value. We can do an empty yield as well. So in an empty yield, you'll notice we're not returning a key, we're not returning a value, but in this case, we still actually wind up pausing. So PHP actually will pause here at each time. So in this get range 4, right, where we echo value, this value here basically is like a null value, right? So this value becomes a null. So we have value, null, value, null, value, null, right? You notice one of the cool things with this, right? We're actually pausing the execution of this get range, right? And we're able to do other stuff inside of here. So like we could have like 100 lines inside of this for each, and each of those 100 lines would execute before we get back around to get range. We can yield by reference as well. So if we want to yield a key by reference, right? In this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying get range is going to return a value by reference, right? We're going to yield a key and a value, same as before. When we call get range, we have the key here and the value here, right? So when we go through our loop, right, we call echo key value, right? Key is still that 1 value that we expect. The value here is the 4 that we expect, because 4 is our max from here, right? So we pass in 4, so we should expect 4 to be here, right? So we execute that line of code, right? Remember, I said we can execute as many lines of code as we want until we get back to that get range again. So here we increment key by 1. So now key becomes 2. We come back to get range. Key and I are the same value, right? They're passed by reference, not by value. They're passed by reference here. So now this I, when we increment it, is no longer, it's not 1 plus plus, it's 2 plus plus. So now it becomes 3. 3 is still less than 4. So we do execute another yield, right? We get 3 and 4. But now key becomes 4, right? We go back into get range. 4 gets incremented by 1 again, and it becomes 5 is no longer less than max. So we kick out of this function right away. We can also return values, right? So what happens when we return a value? So same thing. We have this for each loop, right? And now we're setting it equal to, or we're setting it equal to a return, right? So we'll do the same sort of loop that we did before, right? We'll loop over this. We'll keep looping over this, right? When we're doing the yield and all that fun stuff, right? That's that loop. However, then this generator has a return associated with it, and we can call a function a get return. And that get return will return the return value of the generator. So the generator can return actually 3 values out of this, right? We can return a key, we can return a value, the key can be returned by reference, and we can actually have a return value if we want, right? So generators, complex if you decide to do all this crazy complex nonsense. If you want, right, at the end of the day, you can still just do this sort of thing, right? The advantage you have here with this, right, when you're doing this yield, is if you're looping over some set of records, right, this generator, the only value that's in memory when it's dealing with it is just the value that it's executing and processing right at that moment in time. So imagine you're looping over a CSV or you're looping over a database, right? Something else along those lines where you have a bunch of records, right? And you're returning the records back and you need to process them in some way. If you do that as a generator, the only record that you're having to deal with is just the record that you're modifying with at that point in time. You can also do an early return. So if we have an early return where we return after we yield, right? So in this case, we have this return right after we yield, right? So what winds up happening? We call gen is equal to get range as key value, right? We pass in the 4 as the max, I is equal to 1, 1 is less than 4, we yield 1, right? So that kicks back, we get 1 and our value, right? Key of 0, in this case, because I didn't return actually a key back, right? You'll notice I'm calling it as if I get a key value pair, right? But I didn't actually return a key value pair. So here, that I is the only value, right? So that's our value of 1 and our key of 0, right? We execute that. We come back around. We call get range again. We stop pausing at the end of this semicolon, right? On this yield line. And we come to return. And the return, because it's before this has finished, this actually kicks out of get range. So get range actually ends here. Get range essentially has no more values, even though technically we haven't finished this loop, right? Even though this loop still has more iterations that it could occur, because we had this early return here and we told it to return early, it kicks back early. And then we can echo gen get return, right? If we want to. And that'll just, in this case, it'll just return a null because that return is an empty return. So when we do this empty return, it'll end that generator early if we need it to. I got code samples. Make stuff big. What is this? I even left myself nice little instructions on what exactly I was doing. All right, so we're going to look first at get range array, right? So here's an array. We have a max of 10. We have an array, right? This is a very simple, just loop over and build an array with, you know, a bunch of values in it, and then just return that array, right? Oh, I should make that bigger as well. So that's our get range array, right? Loop over an array, return a bunch of values. Pretty simple. Now, what if we try doing get range array with PHP int max, right? So now this time, let's try throwing every possible value that PHP knows about into our array. Did I save it? Allowed memory storage, right? Because our array has to try sticking all that into memory and it just fails, right? So we can't do that. All right, what about a generator? So here's our get range generator, right? You should have seen, looks fairly similar, right? We're just looping over, and the only difference, rather than using a return, we're just using a yield. So we're just yielding the value back. Not used to having to hit save for some reason. The generator totally works, as we expect. Nothing unusual about that. All right. If we try get range generator with a PHP int max, sure I hit save. And we run that, and that's just going to keep going and going and going, right? I can just let that run forever, right? Our array completely failed to process anything, but this is just going to keep running and running and running forever. Now, what about, remember where I talked about iterators require a lot more overhead versus the generator? So this is basically the simplest iterator that I can write. Here's the simplest generator that I can write. It's 4 lines, right? And realistically, like if you want to be kind of ugly, you could make it even shorter, right? It's like 2 lines of code, really, like 3 lines of code. The iterator, on the other hand, right, from line 18 to line 46, 28 lines of code. That is the simplest iterator that you can write, essentially. And it's doing the exact same thing, right? So for the iterator, we have to set up a position. We have to set up a max value. We have to have a constructor. We got to define a rewind function, a current function, a key function, a next function, a valid function, right? And you'll note all this is doing is literally like rewind is just saying, oh, reset the position to 0, basically to the 0th position. Current is just returning the position. Key is just returning the position. Next is just incrementing the position pointer, basically, right? Position is less than max if it's valid, right? And it just takes that max value, right? That is the simplest iterator that you can write, and it's 28-ish lines of code, give or take. But it'll do the same sort of thing. There's our iterator running through. And same sort of thing. The advantage the iterator has over the array, again, it'll just keep running forever and ever and ever, right? I told it to loop over the int max values, and it'll just keep looping over. All right. So those were some samples. So generators, where are we on those? Generators are iterators without that iterator overhead, right? Generators can be interrupted in processing via that yield keyword, right? That's literally what we're doing. We're stopping PHP from running the main function that the generator is operating on. The return call actually will end a generator. You can operate a generator using those iterator methods, the current, the next, and the key methods. And except for rewind, generators are forward-only iterators, right? Generators only go in one direction, just forward, right? You can't loop through a generator backwards, right? In an iterator, you can go backwards and forwards and basically any way that you want to, right? Okay. Now, what's the really fun sort of stuff with this? One of the really fun sort of things with this is you can do a thing called a coroutine. Coroutines are programs that allow for a non-preemptive multitasking via multiple entry points for suspending and returning. What the heck does that mean? That means if I'm writing code in which I want to be able to jump around in my code, and I want to be able to suspend the execution of some code and then return back to it at a later point in time, or have multiple ways of entering my code and jump around inside of that code without using something like a goto, I can do that in a coroutine. You'll note that's exactly what a generator allows you to do. A generator allows you to stop processing, go into a different section of code, come back, or even exit the generator and enter back in at a different location. We're going to have to figure out some more. We're going to have to get some more information, though, to do that. But the yield is that trick here, right? We can pause the execution of one method and then continue on in a different method when we use that yield keyword. So again, more knowledge of generator. So if you were confused beforehand, we're just going to get a little more confusing, unfortunately. We can use a yield from. So what does yield from look like? Okay, so I have a generator. You'll notice all this generator is doing is just calling a bunch of yields, right? Yield 1, yield 2, yield from gen 2, yield 5, gen 2, yield 3, yield 4. Okay, so for each gen as val, right? So we call gen, go into gen, yield 1, pause, come back to here, 1 is now val. We loop around, we echo 1 and then an empty space, come back around, we call gen. Pause here, enter into yield, finish that line, right? That at that semicolon, we unpaused here, restarted this, we yield 2, pause. 2 is now val. We loop around, we echo 2, empty space, come back around, call gen. This for each pauses, go back in, we restart from here from the end of this semicolon, come back around, and we say yield from gen 2. Gen 2 says, this yield from says, oh, what we really want to do is we want to yield the values from here. So now this says, okay, grab the values and execute gen 2. So we pause here basically, go into gen 2, we call in yield 3, right? We go into gen 2, we say yield 3, pause here, pop the 3 into here, right? Imagine you have a stack. So we have 3 here. This says yield from here. So we want to yield the value from gen 2. So we're yielding that 3 into gen, right? And into this for each. So now we have 3 as the value. We echo here. We come back around. We loop back around. We say go back into gen. We go into here. We unpause here. But what we do is we say, oh, because we're using yield from, we need to keep going through gen 2 until gen 2 is done. So now we come back to here. We unpause after this yield 3. We yield 4, pause here. 4 gets popped up the stack here. 4 gets popped up the stack out of gen into as val. Echo val, so we echo the 4, come back around, call gen again. We call back in here. We're in this yield from. We look at gen 2 and gen 2 says, hey, I'm out of values. And we say, cool, you're done. That line of code is done. And then we call yield 5, pause execution, pop 5 up into the as val, echo 5. We loop back around. We talk to gen and gen says, hey, I'm done. And so this execution is totally done. So we can yield from an inner generator in here with this. You note that yield from, right? We're pausing the execution of multiple lines of code at that point. Okay. We can also send values. So what does that look like? So gen print is just an infinite loop. We're going to have this while true. We're going to have a string is equal to yield. So it's an empty yield. We haven't quite seen that before, but we'll get through this. It'll be okay. And then we're going to echo the string, right? So what's going to happen? So gen print, we're going to say, okay, create an instance of gen print, right? Instantiate the function and save it to this value, this variable print, right? What is print? In this case, it's an instance of an iterator and an instance of a generator, right? That's the actual under the hood of what PHP sees that as. On print send, right? So we call print, we say, oh, send a value to it as fizz. What that does is that calls gen print, kicks off its execution, comes to the first yield, pushes fizz into the return for that yield, the equal side of that on this side, the left-hand side, right? Left-hand side of the equal sign, right? So the result of that yield becomes that string. We echo string, we come back around, we loop, we pause execution here again, we come back out here, we call print send buzz, right? We push buzz into the yield becomes string, or excuse me, buzz becomes string, and then we echo string and then loop back around, pause again, and we don't do anything else since we didn't call anything else. Very, very weird, right? We can pull values out of our generator. We can push values into our generator. We can yield by reference. We can yield key value pairs. We can exit early with a return, right? Generators are mind-blowing kind of code, like trying to understand exactly all the different things that are occurring inside of them.
Yeah, how does it not get stuck in that while true? That's the part that blows my mind. You know?
Well, so like this loop eventually, like like when this PHP line of code is done, right? This just gets garbage collected, right? Because like nothing else has called it, right? So like if your file is done and over with, right, this then just like throws itself out, right? And these yield pauses the execution of it. So even though this looks like an infinite loop, because of those pauses, right? Whenever you get to the next yield, you pause the execution of it, right? So you paused your infinite loop, and then you just said, well, I don't need gen print anymore. Like, you know, whatever function, whatever file you would have this in, like after PHP is done running, if you don't call gen print again, it never needs gen print again. So it just, you know, gets rid of it and garbage collects it and everything.
What would happen if you don't put it around a while true? Would it kill the application?
Well, so like if you did this, so if you had this just as one, right? So you would send fizz, right, to this first one, you would echo fizz, and then gen print would be done, right? There would be no more, there wouldn't be any other yield for it to come back to, right? So you would have sent fizz,
Oh, yeah,
and then
yeah,
when you
yeah.
call print send buzz, it wouldn't do anything because it's like, well, I don't have another yield to pass back into.
Now, because this is an instance of an iterator, what would happen if you, say, did print arrow rewind on this at the end?
So if you, so after, so you did print send fizz, right? Print send buzz, right? And then you said print arrow rewind.
Yeah.
Because it's a true loop. I don't think it would. I mean, it wouldn't really do anything, would it? Right? Like,
I don't know. I'm just trying to get all the possibilities that this might be, how this might be useful.
Yeah, I don't know for sure what would happen if you called rewind on print, right? I'm thinking through it because the idea of rewind is to basically rewind back to the first key. So I guess in theory, I'm not sure. Because mainly, so like generators, you can't actually, like you can't step back in them. So you can't step back just one, right? In a generator, when you call rewind, it's basically to reset the generator. So it's as if the generator like never got called in the first place. So I think that's probably what it would do in theory, is it would basically act as if it would basically stop. So you were at here, print send buzz, right? You echo buzz here, empty space, loop back around, you're in the while true, you come back to here, you pause execution here, right? Waiting for something to be sent to it. If you call rewind, it would basically go all the way back to the start of genprint, I think. Because in a generator, there's no like, you can't rewind one step, right? You only rewind all the way. So I think it would be as if you got back to this point where print is equal to genprint. Like it would be back to this state where you hadn't called it, you hadn't done anything with it, like it just being instantiated.
So basically, if you had done something with references using the ampersand, you might be able to wipe those by doing a rewind, keeping the same object.
Yeah, that sounds plausible. I think that's right. I think that's right. That's a really good question, though. I hadn't thought about that before. That's a really, really good question. Okay, so even more complicated, we can send and receive values, right? So because a yield actually, you know, returns a value back to us, now we're going to get complicated. Okay, so I call print equals gen print, right? I call echo print send. Okay. What the F happens here is the valid sort of thing. So I call function gen print while true. What winds up happening, so I call print send. Print send has to find the first yield. It says, oh, execute until you get to the first yield. Okay. So what happens? Gen print kicks off. We go while true, yield return val. This yield, that return val essentially gets eaten. Why does that happen? Well, it happens because this print send, right, never actually asked for a value back, right? Like we just pushed a value to it. So this return val essentially just got eaten, right? Got killed off, right? So print send fizz, right, pushes fizz into sent, echo fizz and then PHP end of line, right? So now we go, that displays that here, right? We loop back around while true. We come back here and then we yield return val, right? So end of line. So we return the val, we pause execution, right? We come back to here and then we call echo print send buzz. That pushes buzz as our sent value. We unpause execution. We echo buzz PHP end of line, loop back around, yield the return val, and pause execution again, right? Because we come back around to that yield value and then pause execution. You'll notice what happened. We essentially skipped over the first yield, right? We didn't actually skip over it, right? Like we did pause execution at that first yield, but because that first yield returned a value and we didn't actually ask for that value, right? We basically just ignored it. Does that make sense? Okay. So now, even more complicated. With the different quite value of, right? Yeah, this is the next one. Okay. Print gen print, echo print send fizz, right? So come back around. We call gen print for I is equal to 1, I is less than 15, I plus plus, right? So I is equal to 1, right? We come around, print send fizz, right? Remember, so we kick off print or kick off gen print, sorry, excuse me. We kick off gen print. We come back around, we pause the execution at this first yield, right? This send says, hey, find the first yield and pause execution and pass in this value, right? This one gets eaten up, right? We don't do anything with it. Like it doesn't actually get returned to anywhere. So string is equal to fizz, we echo fizz and a blank space. Loop back around, I gets incremented by 1. So now I is equal to 2, 2 is still less than 15. We come back around, we yield that 2, right? So that 2 gets returned. And because we're out of yield, we pause execution here. So we pause execution here. We come back to the consumer. So again, the consumer of our generator. And it says, oh, echo print send buzz. Again, buzz says, hey, pause on the, find the first yield. We're at the first yield, right? That you see. Push buzz in. So push buzz in, that becomes string. So echo buzz and then space, right? Echo buzz space. Loop back around. 2 gets incremented by 1, becomes 3. 3 is less than 15. We yield the 3 back, right? So we yield the 3 and then we pause execution again. Very, very trippy sort of stuff, right? Because we're pausing execution, right? And even though we're pausing execution, like basically at that semicolon, right? We've actually paused basically halfway through the statement. Okay, so send and receive. Send executes the generator by passing the input in, then yields the return value of the generator, right? That's what we can see here. Send tells it to say, kick off the generator, push the value into the first yield that you see, continue on until you get to the next yield, return that value back, and then pause the execution of the generator. So now we can kind of put more pieces together. So if we actually put that together with a current, right? Current calls the first yield. So now if we do this where we actually call echo print current, right? This will actually yield that return value here. Pause the execution, call echo print send fizz. Fizz becomes sent. Echo fizz, PHP end of line, loop back around, yield, we're at a yield, we pause execution, return val gets popped back. That becomes return val here, right? On this line. Then echo print send buzz, right? That pushes buzz to send, kicks off, tells the generator to keep moving through the code. Echo buzz, PHP end of line, right? Loop back around, while true, yield the return val. So yield our return val and then pause the execution. And then same thing like you were asking before about like Josh, right? Like this function, right? Like technically could keep going on forever if we wanted to, right? We've just not calling it anymore, right? We're just ignoring it. So send, receive, and current. This is kind of the same sort of thing in case there's any confusion. I'm trying to clear up a little bit of what's going on here, right? Echo print current, right? 1 is the current, right? So we echo the 1, right? Pause the execution, echo print send fizz, push fizz in, right? Fizz becomes the sent, fizz PHP end of line, right? Echo, we loop back around, we yield the 2 becomes there. Because we're at a yield, we pause the execution of the function, wait for something to tell the generator to do something. In this case, when we call echo print send buzz, right, that tells the generator to do something, kicks it back off, buzz becomes sent, echo buzz and PHP end of line, loop back around, and we yield I, which is 3 here. So send executes the generator by passing in the input, then yields the return value of the generator, right? When we call send, right, we call fizz, we loop back around until we get to the next yield, we execute that yield, and then we pause the execution of the generator. Current just yields the return value of the generator, right? So current just like calls whatever that first yield is and just pulls out that return value. Putting more of it together. What happens when you have multiple yields and you have a send and you have a receive and you're trying to use current? Okay, so let's get even more complicated. So we have print is equal to gen print, right? Echo print current, right? Find the first yield, get the value, the return value or the yielded value, right? So that becomes this return val. Oop, there. Pause the execution here, right? We just yielded our value. Now we pause the execution because that's all that current told us to do. We call echo print send fizz. That says kick off the generator again, put fizz as sent, so sent, echo sent PHP end of line, so echo fizz end of line. Come back around, yield return val 2, pause execution. We yield return val 2, right? That gets echoed here. We come back and we say echo print send buzz, right? So buzz gets pushed in as this second sent. We echo buzz PHP end of line, right? Loop like that. We loop back around and we get back to yield return val, and then we pause execution, right? Return val gets passed into here. We echo that and we're there. So send executes the generator by passing in the input. Yield yields the return value of the generator. Current just yields the return value of the generator. And each yield means we have another exit depending on where in the iteration we are, right? So we can have these multiple yields and return or come out of this this gen print function, right? Our generator, we can come out of that generator at multiple points. Each iteration, first we yield, first yield, second yield, then we loop and we repeat, right? First yield, then a second yield, and then we loop and repeat. I got an example of this and it is extremely, extremely complicated. So feel free. This is where my knowledge gets a little bit fuzzier. So we're putting it all together to build ourselves a coroutine, right? And I will admit, this code is very heavily cribbed from some existing tutorials and other people's code online. My cat wants to be on the call. Okay, so we have a task. Our task takes a task ID, a coroutine thingy, a send value, a before first yield, right? We have a constructor, we have a task ID and a coroutine that it takes, right? We have a get task ID function, we have a set send value, and we have a run, right? This isn't really doing much. Don't worry too much about that at the moment. And then we ask if it's finished, right? We call a scheduler, right? Our scheduler is, we have a map, we have an array basically, or we have a set of tasks, right? So we're building up a queue, right? So we actually create an SPL queue and we create our new task, right? Our new task is we take in a generator, we set the task ID to it. So we're going to have a task ID 0, and then we'll have task ID 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth, right? We create a new task, which has a task ID and the coroutine, right? And then we map them into array, and then we call this schedule function. And all that does is just push the task onto our queue, and then we return the task ID, right? And so we have this run, right? And so we have a task queue. If the task queue is empty, or sorry, while the task queue is not empty, we tell the task queue to dequeue. So we pop a thing off the task and we tell the task to run. If the task is finished, we remove that task from the task map, right? So we have an array. Else, we schedule the task and we tell the task, oh, okay, pause execution. We'll come back to you next time, right? So the high level idea of what's happening here. We have a queue, right? And our queue is basically looping through an array of a series of tasks. So imagine we have, 5 different tasks, right? And each of those tasks has a series of jobs that they're doing, right? So we have task 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Task 1, we execute, we pause the execution of task 1, we go to task 2, run that, pause execution, go to task 3, run that, go to task 4, run that, pause, go back to task 5, go to task 5, pause, return to task 1, and carry on until we're through our entire queue of tasks and jobs. So we have task 1. Task 1 is we're going to loop over from 1 to 10, and we're going to say that it's task 1 iteration, right? You could imagine this being a much more complicated task. Task 2 is we're going to loop over from 1 to 5, right? We have our scheduler. We call it in new task and new task, right? And then we have scheduler run. So PHP coroutine. So task 1, iteration 1, right? Task 2, iteration 1, right? So notice what happens, right? Our coroutine and our scheduler basically sets up, and we have a queue. We have this array with multiple tasks shoved into it. We say, okay, pick off each task, run 1 iteration through it, do the work that we want to do in that work, and then pause the execution, and then continue on with our second task. So task 1, iteration 1, task 2, iteration 1, task 1, iteration 2, task 2, iteration 2, so on and so forth until we get to 5. Task 2 is done because we only had 5 things that was needing to do. And then we continue on with task 1, iteration 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there's a coroutine. So notice the value of this, right, is we're able to jump in and out of this code, right? We're able to have this code, have this scheduler, right? Literally be able to run a series of jobs and execute that work, right? Pause the execution, come back, execute a different set of tasks. So you could envision this even if you had something like, let's say you have a jobs processing system, right? Where you have to do a series of things for like each record in the database, right? But you have to do them in sequence and in order, right? So imagine you have, 1 million records in a database and you have to run them through a pipeline, right? Or let's go bigger. Like let's say you have, 100 million records in a database. And for each of the rows in the database, you have to run them through a series of jobs. Like you have to run them through and process them in a series of operations, right? Maybe you have to throw out bad records. Maybe you have to take an average. Maybe you have to do a median and mode. And maybe some of those operations are built off of each other, right? So like you don't want to take the average of all the records because you need to get rid of first the bad records, right? But you want to do it in this series of operations, right? Like in a pipeline style, right? This is the sort of way that you could do that sort of operation where you could say, oh, run these series of tasks on this job, right? One by one by one by one, right? And just keep iterating back and forth, right? And since it's a generator, you don't have to worry about the memory usage or anything else. So that is generators. That's my Twitter. That's my GitHub. That's still me. That's actually I still work at thewirecutter.com, but that URL is no longer our official URL. It's now nytimes.com/wirecutter. You should go there instead. I haven't done a LinkedIn learning video in a while, but they're still publicly available and you should still watch them. I still make money if you watch them, although the money is getting less and less as I haven't done them in a while, but you should still watch them. And yeah, that's the whole thing. Questions?
Do you mind sending me that repo again?
Yeah, I'll send you, and I'll send you the docs as well. I can send you a PDF of the docs, and I'll send you the repo and such. Yeah.
Sweet, thanks.
So I wanted to talk about the question that I brought up. That rewind does not work. PHP goes, this is a generator that's already gone through. You can't do that here.
Oh, really? Is that what it does? Okay. I thought like, what do I have in my docs or my slides? Because I know I do mention that like rewind doesn't really work. I think there is a like, you can, oh no, except for rewind, generators are forward only iterators. Yeah. So like there's a way in which you can use rewind. Like there's some sort of like tricky hacky thing where you can say rewind as you can rewind all the way to the back. Like you can't rewind halfway. You have to rewind all the way to the front or something. Like, or basically like it's reset or something, basically.
I rebuilt the code you had and I tried to run a rewind and it went, yeah, cannot rewind a generator that's already run.
Okay.
One thing that wasn't, and this just may have been me missing it, one thing that was a little unclear was that the yield was what was being passed back from running print send, whereas the echo was what was being sent. The echo inside the functions what was being sent with send. Like I didn't catch that at first.
Yeah, so just to, I think it's kind of clearer in like this get range generator. So like this yield, right? This just passes a value back, right? Yeah. So then the echo actually occurs here, right? So then in the slides, when we look at, pick one of the easier or one of the simpler examples. Is there one where there's the multiple echoes?
That one right there.
Yeah, so like this one, right? So this echoes here, right? This yield, it just is returning a value, right? The echo, is taking place here, right? This yield, it's just returning a variable, right? It's not telling it to do anything with it, right? It's literally a function returning a value back.
Yeah.
But it is
because there was an echo in both places, my brain didn't catch that.
Oh yeah, no, it is super confusing. Like generators are so wild. They're also like, I don't know. I really love generators in the sense of like they are super cool, like cubbyhole of PHP, right? They're really fun to play around with. They're also like wildly impractical because they're just so confusing. They're so hard to test. They're so hard to figure out. They're so just so confusing. I love them in the sense of like they're like this neat little like area of PHP that's just like this is really funny and interesting. Thank you. But they're just like really confusing. I think generators are really great in the like, oh, I need to loop over a CSV and I don't want to write a real iterator, but it's like a million line CSV and I don't want to load that into memory because I'm worried about something. Dinner is being served for me. So yeah, whereas, I mean, like I said, I mean, the iterator is a lot more complex to write. So if you're writing something that you want this like long-term, right? But like many of the database wrappers now, like many of the ORMs now, their classes to return records from the database now are typically iterators. Because it makes it so much easier because you don't have to worry about, oh, what happens if you have a select all from your I don't know, your massive analytics table, right? And you accidentally run a select all. Like you don't want to crash your PHP application because you accidentally run a select all. So instead, they all write them as iterators. So that way, if you run select all on your analytics table and you have 100 million records, PHP is just like, whatever.
That's something I wanted. Oh, it's interesting. I sometimes dabble in Python, and at first, some of the generators, like when you're looping through numbers, really reminded me of the range function.
Yeah, for sure.
But it doesn't have the ability to like run the function and just assign it to a variable if needed. Because like in Python, you can go range this and you can run it through a loop, or you can assign it to a variable and that becomes a list. Is there any way to do that with this, or is that just completely avoiding the principle?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of avoiding the principle, right? Because the point of the yield is that you're not having the memory overhead. So then if you want to assign it to like something, right, you're creating the memory overhead, right? And really, if you want to have something where it's like, oh, I need to have something, right? So like, again, the iterator is kind of like the more complex version of that, where it's like, if I need to like manipulate this or do something with it, right? Like really an iterator is the right solution, is the right tool for that sort of job, right? The generator is really like there are some things that the generator can do, right? That like an iterator can be like harder to implement because of the yield, like with it pausing that execution and such, right? And giving you the ability to jump in, jump out of code, right? If you need that sort of thing, right? But like if you're looking at like, oh, I have a bunch of records and I need to manipulate them or fudge with them, or I don't know, whatever. I mean, that's the most common example because that's where I think of iterators most often is like, oh, I need to loop over a CSV. I have a database. I have a bunch of events that I need to do something with, right? The iterator becomes a much more straightforward sort of thing because your iterator can just wrap over all those records and then manipulate each record in a time and just get rid of it, right? Like PHP will push it out of memory space, or well, it eventually will if it doesn't need it, right?
Yeah.
Sweet. Awesome. Go ahead and hit pause on the recording there. And